I remember the exact moment I stopped understanding humans. It was not when they first arrived at Axis Prime with only 3 delegates, while every other civilization sent hundreds. It was not when their ambassador unpacked a meal container at the most important diplomatic table in the galaxy. It was the sound. A small, ordinary, devastating crunch. The hegemon of the Valdori Dominion had just declared war on an entire species, and the human ambassador was chewing. I am Consul Enith of the Marathi Confederation. I have spent 20 years studying humanity. I have read their history, analyzed their conflicts, mapped their psychology across 37 academic papers written by minds far sharper than my own. I believed I understood them reasonably well. Interesting creatures, emotional, stubborn, occasionally brilliant. I thought I had them categorized. I was completely wrong, and it took one sandwich to prove it. The conclave hall on Axis Prime seats 4,000 delegates. On that morning, every seat was filled. Word had spread quietly through diplomatic channels over the preceding weeks that the Valdori Dominion was preparing something significant, and significant things, involving the Valdori, had a long history of being terrible for everyone else. The hall smelled of nervous energy and the various biological secretions that different species produce when they are frightened, which is an unpleasant combination at the best of times. The human table was near the center of the room, as protocol demanded for a species of their registered standing. 3 chairs, 3 humans. I counted twice because I was certain I had miscounted. Every major civilization had sent delegations of 50 or more. The Quarren had brought 216 representatives, all of them clicking their mandibles in the specific rhythm that indicated collective anxiety. The Valdori themselves occupied an elevated platform at the front of the hall, draped in ceremonial banners, and the quiet, practiced confidence of a power that had never once been told no, and meant it. The senior human delegate was a woman named Director Mara Osei. I had read her file. Born in a place called Accra, educated across 3 continents, which is a human way of saying she had studied in regions of their single home planet that were separated by large amounts of salt water. She had been Earth's senior ambassador to the Galactic Conclave for 11 years. Her file described her as patient, perceptive, and unusually difficult to rattle. The file had undersold her considerably. She was eating lunch. Not snacking, not picking at something absently. She had a full meal laid out in a container that she had clearly prepared herself and carried from wherever humans stay when they visit Axis Prime. She was eating with focused, genuine enjoyment, occasionally making small notes on a paper pad beside her. The kind of notes a person makes when they are working through a problem that mildly interests them. The 2 humans with her were both occupied with tablets. None of them were speaking. They looked like people waiting for a meeting they had already decided would not surprise them. The Quarren ambassador, Seelith, was seated 2 tables away from the humans. I could see his compound eyes tracking Mara's sandwich with an expression I can only describe as personal offense. He had been one of the first to ally his species with humanity after their arrival in galactic politics, and I had always suspected this was because he found them fascinating, in the same way one finds a fire fascinating, beautiful, warming, and capable of burning everything down. Hegemon Vral Soth rose from the Valdori platform. The hall fell silent. Not gradually, the way silence usually descends on large crowds, but immediately, as though someone had reached into the room and removed all the sound at once. Vral Soth was tall even by Valdori standards, his ceremonial armor catching the hall's light in ways that their engineers had specifically designed to be intimidating. He wore the crown of Dominion, which is not actually a crown, but rather a set of neural amplifiers that broadcast his words directly into the emotional processing centers of most known species. When a hegemon of the Valdori spoke in the crown, you did not just hear the words, you felt them. He spoke for 4 minutes in High Valdori. The translation came through my earpiece in the careful, measured tones of a professional interpreter who was clearly doing their very best to keep their voice steady. The Valdori Dominion formally declared humanity an enemy of the state. All human vessels were to be considered hostile within Dominion space effective immediately. Humanity's border colonies, 7 of them, were to be surrendered within 30 cycles. Failure to comply would result in military action of a scale and nature that the hegemon described in specific, unpleasant detail. The declaration ended with a traditional Valdorii phrase that translated roughly as, "There is no version of this where you do not yield." The hall remained silent. And then there was a crunch. Mara Osei had taken a bite of her sandwich. I watched Vralsoth's neck frills extend fully, which in Valdori body language signals a combination of disbelief and rising fury. The Crown of Dominion, which had just delivered a war declaration into the emotional core of 4,000 beings, had apparently not penetrated whatever wall of calm surrounded the human ambassador. She chewed. She looked at her notepad. She wrote something down. She took another bite. Seelith moved to her table so quickly that I did not see him stand. He was simply suddenly there, his mandibles moving in rapid, distressed patterns. I was close enough to hear him. He said, very quietly and very urgently, that the Valdorii Dominion had just declared war upon her species. I believe he thought she had not heard. She nodded pleasantly. She said she had heard. She said it in the tone of someone who has been informed that it is raining outside and has decided this is mildly inconvenient, but essentially manageable. She finished her sandwich. Vralsoth demanded a formal response. His voice through the crown was doing something it rarely did, which was asking. The Valdorii do not ask. They announce, they demand, they declare. Asking was not in their ceremonial vocabulary, and yet there was something in the way the human was sitting there, calmly folding her meal container closed and dabbing her mouth with a small cloth, that had introduced a note of uncertainty into a voice that had never previously contained one. Mara looked up. She held up one finger, in a gesture I later learned meant, "Please wait just one moment." She finished folding her cloth. She placed it to the side. She looked at Vralsoth with the expression of someone reviewing a mildly complicated scheduling conflict. She asked if Tuesday would work for an official response. She explained that her government was approximately 6 hours behind on time zones, and she would need to flag this to them first. The interpreter paused before translating the word Tuesday. There is no equivalent in Valdori. There is no equivalent in most galactic languages. It is a purely human word for a unit of time that only exists because their single moon created a calendar system that no other species independently invented. The pause lasted 3 seconds, while the interpreter explained this in a footnote. The hall processed the information that the human ambassador had responded to a declaration of war by asking if a specific, untranslatable day of her planet's weekly cycle was convenient. 4,000 delegates sat in complete silence. Seelith had both sets of his arms braced against the human table. I could see from across the room that he was holding himself very still in the way that prey animals do when they believe something large is very close. I opened my own notepad and wrote, "Humans are structurally different from us in some way I do not yet have words for." A junior Valdori attaché moved quickly across the platform and whispered something to Vralsoth. The hegemon's color shifted. In Valdoria physiology, color change indicates strong internal processing, usually surprise or recalculation. I had never seen a hegemon change color during a formal declaration. The crown of dominion flickered briefly, which I was told afterward had never happened before in recorded history. I did not find out until later what the attaché had said. The Valdori intelligence assessment of human military capacity had been quietly updated 3 hours earlier by analysts who had noticed something unusual in deep space sensor data. Earth's third rapid deployment force had been running exercises 17 light minutes from Axis Prime for 72 hours, unannounced, unscheduled. The exercises were of a type and scale that suggested they were not exercises in any meaningful sense of the word. Nobody had told the conclave. Nobody had told the Valdorii. The humans had not mentioned it because, as nearly as anyone could determine, they had simply not considered it worth bringing up. While the Valdorii platform buzzed with quiet, urgent conversation, Mara Osei turned to me. I do not know why she chose me. Perhaps I was simply the nearest neutral observer. She leaned slightly in my direction and asked, in a conversational tone, whether I would like the remainder of her chips, since she was full. I declined. She ate them herself, and while she did, she talked to me. I have thought about that conversation every day since. She said that humanity had been at war, in various forms, for essentially its entire recorded history. Not with other species, but with itself. On one small planet, with no outside threats to unite against, human groups had fought each other across centuries using every tool and technology available to them at the time. They had started with sharpened stones and ended with weapons capable of ending their own civilization. She said this without drama, the way one describes an old scar. It is there, it is real. You have simply stopped being surprised by it. She said the Valdori were used to fighting species that calculated their odds and made rational decisions accordingly. A civilization that models outcomes and responds to superior force by yielding is a civilization that can be managed with the right display of power. You show them the fleet, you show them the numbers, and the rational response is surrender. It works every time, because most species in the galaxy evolved in conditions that rewarded survival calculus. She said humans had not evolved that way. She said it quietly, and without any pride in her voice, which was somehow more alarming than if she had said it with all the pride in the world. She said that humans fight when they are afraid. They fight when they are exhausted. They fight when every reasonable analysis says they have already lost. And they fight longest and hardest, precisely in the moments when fighting makes the least logical sense. She said this was not a virtue. It was simply a fact about what they were, built by a history that selected for stubbornness over sense, more times than she cared to count. I asked her if she was not afraid. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the Valdori platform, where Vralsoth was still receiving whispered updates, his color still shifting. Then she looked back at me, with the expression of someone answering a question honestly that they could easily have answered with something more comfortable. She said she was annoyed. She said she'd had a good week planned. The doors to the conclave hall opened 40 minutes into the standoff. A human woman in military uniform walked in, carrying a cup of hot liquid, and moving at the pace of someone who had been slightly delayed by something trivial. This was General Adeyeze Howe, Earth's military liaison to the conclave. She was 20 minutes late. She located Mara across the hall, made a small apologetic gesture, and moved to the human table. Mara told her quietly that there had been a war declaration. General Howe looked at the Valdori platform. She looked back at Mara. Her expression contained several things in rapid succession, and the last of them was something that I can only describe as mild administrative resignation. She sat down, took a long drink from her cup, and pulled out a tablet. She began typing. Vralsoth gathered himself and demanded, formally and finally, the human response to the Dominion's declaration. He stated again that the 30-cycle ultimatum stood. He asked whether humanity would yield its border colonies. Mara stood. The hall went quiet again. She stood the way people stand when they are not performing standing, but simply occupying space with full intention. She looked at Vralsoth, and she spoke clearly and without raising her voice, and every word landed in the hall like something being set down firmly on a solid surface. She said the United Earth government acknowledged receipt of the declaration. She said the border colonies were sovereign human territory and would not be surrendered. She said any military action against them would be treated as war against all of humanity, and responded to in full. She said Earth preferred a diplomatic resolution and was available Thursday. She suggested the Valdori bring snacks, because she expected the conversation would take a while. She sat back down. The hall was silent for 11 seconds. I counted every one. Vralsoth said, very quietly, that the Dominion did not negotiate with those who showed no fear of it. Mara looked at him for a long moment. Her expression was not unkind. It was patient, in the way that deep water is patient, simply present, and very, very still. She said she knew. She said that had always been their problem. In the days that followed, the Valdori fleet that had been positioned near the human border systems did not move forward. A senior Valdori admiral requested a private meeting with General Howe. Howe attended with her cup of hot liquid and returned 2 hours later. 7 Valdori listening posts near human space went dark without explanation. The Dominion issued no further statements. Thursday came, and diplomats gathered, and the conversations were long and difficult, and eventually arrived somewhere that was not war. I sat in my office afterward and wrote my report. I described everything. I described the sandwich. I described the Tuesday. I described Seelith gripping the table, and Vralsoth changing color, and General Howe arriving late with her coffee, as though lateness were simply a human condition, too familiar to apologize for deeply. And at the end of my report, in a section I expected my superiors to remove, I wrote that I had spent 20 years studying humanity and believed I understood them, and that I had been wrong in the most important way possible. I wrote that they were not fearless. I wrote that they were not reckless. I wrote that they were something much harder to explain and much harder to stop, which was a species that had decided somewhere deep in its long and painful history that if something was coming for them, they would rather face it standing up and finishing their lunch. I wrote that the Valdori had woken something up, and I wrote that I was very glad the something had decided, for now, that Thursday worked. When I left the conclave hall for the last time that week, Mara O.C. was packing up her things near the human table. She was humming something softly to herself, an old melody in a language I did not recognize. She did not notice me watching. I did not ask what the song was. I decided I would rather not know.